what it is, you don't
And make it
feel like it.
yourself.
What you don't know, you don't worry about.
Burger and sheep. It's really, what's interesting about his family.
Hi, Mr. Purdum.
Hi, please call me Todd. Nice to be with
Oh,
you.
welcome.
Thank you for
Welcome, Mr.
having me.
Purdum. He was staff writer for The Atlantic, and he served as its California correspondent, covering politics and culture. He was a senior writer at Politico and a contributing editor at Vanity Fair. He was formerly with the New York Times, where he worked for 23 years, covering politics from City Hall to the White House. And he's also held important roles as diplomatic correspondent and Los Angeles bureau chief. During the 2016 presidential election, Purdum wrote extensively about Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, and the legacy of Barack Obama. Todd has been an adjunct instructor at both Dornsife and Annenberg, teaching undergraduate and graduate courses on topics involving the media and government. And he was also a fellow at the Center for Political Future at the University of California. In addition to I won't say it correctly, Desi Arnaz book, he's written, his other books include Something Wonderful, Rogers and Hammerstein's Broadway Revolution, An Idea Whose Time Has Come, Two Presidents, Two Parties, and the Battle for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and Time of Our Choosing, America's War in Iraq. Wow. His newest book is the one we're talking about today, Desi Arnaz, The Man Who Invented Television. It was published this year in 2025. Purdum is a native of Macomb, Illinois, and a graduate of Princeton University. He lives in Los Angeles with his wife, Dee Dee Myers, who was the former Clinton White House press secretary and former executive vice president and director of worldwide corporate communications and public affairs at Warner Brothers. And they have 2 children. So I'd like to welcome you, Todd, and tell you briefly a couple sentences about our Changemakers book group. Each third Wednesday, we discuss a book that focuses on someone or something that changed the world in some way. And so we figured that Desi Arnaz was definitely one of those people. And we're so excited to hear what you have to say about Desi Arnaz and how he made a difference in our world.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Alice, and everybody else, and I hope all is well in Lancaster today. I'm delighted to be here. Somebody reminded me I had completely forgotten that today, October 15th, is the 74th anniversary of the day that I Love Lucy went on the air. So this is a good time to be together today. If you're like me and I see that I'm in the neighborhood of your demographic in terms of our birthdays and eligibility for Social Security, you grew up with Desi Arnaz as Ricky Ricardo. But one of the objects of my book, and I'm so glad you've chosen to feature it, is that Desi Arnaz was much, much more than Ricky Ricardo. He wasn't just a wonderful performer who was always telling his wife she had some splaining to do. He was a pioneering television executive who really helped transform the way television gets made and whose legacy persists to this day. So if you watch an episode of Friends or The Big Bang Theory or old repeats of Mary Tyler Moore or Happy Days, you're seeing a television program made in pretty much the way Desi Arnaz figured out how to make it 75 years ago in Hollywood. He was born to enormous privilege in Cuba. His father was the mayor of Santiago, the island's second largest city. His mother's father was an executive at Bacardi Rum. And he grew up with no expectation that he would become an entertainer. He thought he was probably going to come to the United States, go to Notre Dame, maybe become a lawyer. And it's quite possible we would never have heard of him again. But in 1933, the Cuban government was overthrown in a revolution, and he had to flee to Miami with pretty much whatever he had in his pockets. He reinvented himself as a self-taught musician and helped spark the conga dance craze in America. And then he wound up being cast in a Broadway show called Too Many Girls. And when they made the movie version of that, he came to Hollywood and he met a contract actress who'd already made 60 movies by 1940. And her name was Lucille Ball. And they fell head over heels in love and eloped 6 months later and had a tempestuous 20-year marriage. For most of the 1940s, They were pursuing dual careers. Lucy was a working actress in Hollywood who never quite made it into the top flight of stars. And Desi was mostly on the road with his Latin band and sadly faithful to Lucy only in his fashion. And they were by 1950 on the verge of, they were really in a breaking point in both their marriage and their careers when suddenly an opportunity presented itself. And that was that Lucille Ball had a radio sitcom called My Favorite Husband, and CBS wanted to transfer it to television, but Lucy only wanted to do it if Desi could play her husband. And that led to a situation in which they had to figure out how to persuade the network and skeptical sponsors that the American public would accept this thick accented Cuban American as the husband of an all American redheaded girl like Lucille Ball. And ultimately, it was Desi who made the key decision to take them on a live vaudeville tour of movie theaters around the country. And that persuaded the gatekeepers in New York that the public would accept them. The show was a smash. And the CBS and Philip Morris, the sponsor, the cigarette company, bought I Love Lucy, which quickly became the #1 show on television and remained that way for much of the 1950s, and helped Lucy and Desi found their Desilu Studios, which was became by the end of the 1950s the largest producer of television in the world. So there's quite a story in there, and I'm happy to answer questions you may have or talk more about it. I'm not sure how many of you might have read the book, but if you've read it, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Well, I have to say that I read your book, almost the entire book, the day my husband had neurosurgery. And so, I mean, what a lead in, right? But
I hope it came out all right. I hope the surgery was a success.
Yes, it was pretty miraculous. He's doing great. But it was the perfect book in that situation, talking about these larger than life people and all the larger than life people they associated with and knew, you know, so much not like my life here for sure. So that was so enjoyable, but also to get this tremendous appreciation for Desi's contributions to television. I absolutely had no idea how foundational he was. Yeah.
Well, thank you. That was one of my goals in writing the book, is to rebalance the scales a little bit. I mean, Desi was very, very much the first person to say that the whole success of the show depended on Lucille Ball's brilliance as a comedian and an actress, a fearless, fearless participant in physical comedy, willing to do anything. But Lucy was absolutely insistent to the end of her life, despite their divorce and the tension that had been between them, that Desi was the driving force behind getting the show on the air and building their empire. And she was always quick to give him credit as the person behind the scenes. So I thought when I started out trying to research the book in 2020 that it might be a good moment in our national life together to re-examine this guy and give him a little bit more of the credit that in some ways he was deprived of in his own lifetime. And maybe as I was coming on, I don't know if you were talking about this book or someone else, but I heard someone say that this was depressing. And indeed, the end of Desi's life, the last 25 years of his life, was kind of a sad spiral into depression and alcoholism. But the thing that I take some comfort from is that the legacy that he created is one that still endures to this day, including the fact that television gets made in Los Angeles and sitcoms are still made pretty much the way he helped figure out how to make them all those years ago. So there's an upside as well, even though his own personal life had a kind of a sad ending.
Yes. I particularly appreciated the fact that you did a background history of the Arnaz family and to, know the history of the family that Daisy came from. And my husband and I lived in Mexico, so we recognized Daisy's feeling that as a Latin man, yeah, he had the right to have other women and that kind of thing, because in our town, most of the upper class men had their casitas at the side with their lady, an additional lady there. And so that was really interesting to see how he was very much part of his culture.
Yeah, I mean, for better or worse, he came by it honestly. His father and grandfather both had casa chicas separate. His grandfather had a whole separate household with a parallel set of children, and he was initiated into sex in Santiago by an uncle in the fanciest bordello in town, and that really helped spark a lifelong compulsion to patronize the prostitutes, which really got him into terrible trouble. It is never something that Lucille Ball was comfortable with, but she could tolerate it when it was largely private and between them. As he got more and more famous and more successful, there was more and more attention on him. This behavior made its way into the public press, and it just became humiliating for her and too hard to take. But as you say, he grew up in a culture in which he thought that was the God-given right of a Latin man to, and then he said that it meant nothing about his love for Lucy, and he may have told himself that was the case. She wasn't able to see it that way, and it ultimately became an unbridgeable gap. He had a fascinating life in Cuba. I was lucky to be able to go to Cuba, to Santiago, his hometown, and see the house he was born in, the Jesuit high school he went to school in 10 years before Fidel Castro. And I got a strong sense of the place and how it must have influenced him and how he would have heard all over the town the sounds of music when he was growing up, even if he wasn't a trained musician. Uh, Santiago is the center of Cuban music, and it would have been a big influence on him from his childhood on.
How did you go about researching? I noticed you've got a lot of footnotes, a lot of notes at the end of the book. Where did you go for research?
Well, several places. I was really incredibly fortunate that the Arnaz's daughter, Lucy, who lives in Palm Springs, I met her through mutual friends, and she was ultimately willing to open her family archive, which she keeps in her very well organized garage, to me. And she'd never really shared that with a researcher before. So she gave me everything from his high school report card to medical records and um, drafts of his memoir that didn't wind up making it into the final book. After their mother died, Lucy and Desi Jr. also gave about 80 some scrapbooks to the Library of Congress. And these scrapbooks were kept meticulously over the years by Lucille Ball and her secretary. And they have clippings and correspondence and greeting cards and letters from presidents and so on. So I was able to research those. And then also Desi's father kept 4 scrapbooks in Spanish chronicling his political career in Cuba and Desi's entertainment career. And with the help of a Georgetown University student who's a friend of our son's, who's a Georgetown senior, who's a Cuban American and speaks Spanish, she helped me research those. There are also some papers of their associates and contemporaries at the Motion Picture Academy Library in Beverly Hills. And in his retirement, Desi taught some courses at San Diego State University down in San Diego, and there's some other archival materials there. So I was able to have a mix of research libraries and then personal family papers that were an enormous godsend in helping do this. It was one of the most satisfying parts of doing the book because interviews with people and oral histories are wonderful, but often people are the heroes of their own story and memories get clouded or rose colored. And if you can find contemporary letters or documents, you can really usually go to the bank on those knowing that they come from a place of deep reliability.
So in writing the book, it sounds like most of it was primary research. Has the online world affected how you get that information, or did literally you or someone have to go to the Library of Congress to review the information there, for example?
Most of the online world was a huge help in research in many ways, but most of the archival materials that I was needing in the Library of Congress are not digitized. Some of them are on microfiche, but they're very I find it hard to work on microfiche because they're these large format scrapbooks, and on a reader you can't see the whole page at a time, and you have to constantly be moving it around. So they made an exception and let me look at these very fragile scrapbooks. In some cases, the paper, the newsprint is literally dissolving, and the pages are all brittle. But so and then there are a lot of secondary sources about Desilu, the company. There are a lot of published biographies of Lucille Ball. The only real book that's about Desi himself is his memoir, which came out in 1986. So I relied a lot on other published sources, but for Desi himself, the great uh, stroke of luck was to be able to have access to these personal papers, and including letters from a psychiatrist that he consulted at one point in the 1950s, and that that part of the process, the research is very fun because you feel like you are eavesdropping on history, and and putting yourself back in the moment. And the thing, we all know now how this turned out, that it became this iconic show that 75 years later is still running. When they started it, they didn't have any idea whether it would even be a success at all. And so one of the challenges for a writer is to put yourself back in that moment when it was all just getting started and they didn't know how the story would turn out.
Yeah, I thought that he made a great decision when he said he wanted to own the rights to it, in perpetuity. And then at the time, of course, nobody knew that you'd be watching these, for the next 7 years or whatever.
Absolutely. And he didn't even seem to know for sure that that would be the case. He just thought that it could be a valuable asset. There's apparently some evidence that he thought it might be available to be sold in foreign markets. But the main reason that they decided to film it was so that they could produce the show in Los Angeles, because at that time you couldn't yet transmit a television signal all the way across the country. There was no coaxial cable yet. So if they had done the show in New York, as CBS wanted, they would have had to move there. If they'd done it in Los Angeles, there was no videotape either. So the only way to preserve the show for later broadcast in the East Coast would be to film it off a television and produce something called a kinescope, which was a very blurry, unreliable copy that just really couldn't be improved. So yeah, I mean, you really have to give Desi a lot of credit for understanding how valuable that asset could eventually be, even though he could confess later that he wasn't quite sure why he felt that way. He just thought that it would be something good to have in his pocket.
I have a question. I have a couple of questions, but I'm just curious about one thing you said a few moments ago. I'm curious what his grades were like when you saw his report card.
It's interesting. He went to 1 year of high school in Miami after he came from Cuba, and in his memoir he says that he got straight A's. That isn't really true. He got A's in Spanish, and he got B's and C's in other subjects. But he went to high school in Miami Beach at a Jesuit high school there, where one of his close friends was Al Capone Jr., whose father was in Alcatraz at the time. And he was on the basketball team and the swim team. And his extracurricular activities seemed to be, dating girls. Lucy once said to him, "Too many girls is the story of your life." But yeah, he never went beyond high school, but he was a very bright person, and obviously self-taught. People say that he was he had a voracious, almost photographic memory, so that he could memorize lines of dialogue practically after the first reading, and then spend the rest of his week, working on producing the show and making the business decisions. So something about him was obviously a very canny guy, even though he was self-taught.
I wanted to ask you too, because I thought you were going to say something like that. Is both Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz were just broke the mold. They were out of the box characters, bigger than life.
Yeah.
And I just remember watching them when I was little. And when you're watching something, whether it's a TV or now a movie, it's such fantasy. And you went a lot beyond that, behind the camera, behind the scripts and everything. I wondered if you liked them, as you got so in depth with them. If you would have, what did you think about these characters that you wrote so much in depth about?
Thank you. That's a good question. Yes, the answer is I did like them. It's complicated because I don't think Lucille Ball was a very easy or relaxed person. She had a hard time. The only thing that gave her satisfaction in life, apparently, was terribly hard work. And when she wasn't working on the show, she would go home and compulsively clean the house or reorganize the cabinets or the drawers. She had had a rough childhood herself. Her father died before she was 4 years old, and she was shuffled around among a bunch of relatives at different times. She had a lot of emotional dislocation, as many funny people do. And apparently, she was not at all funny in everyday life. She wasn't a good joke teller. She'd get tangled up, forget the punchline. She was just a genius at physical comedy and at the comedy of situations. So people said if she was telling a story about something that happened to her in real life, she could act it out and be tremendously funny. But if she was trying to tell you like a classic joke with a punchline or whatever, and her daughter Lucy, who was very faithful steward of her parents' legacy and loved them very much, obviously, also is very clear-eyed about the ways in which her mother, who became a mother at almost age 40, her shortcomings as a parent, and she wasn't a particularly easy person. Desi, I think, would have been a very, very likable person, except when he was drinking, and then his personality changed rather dramatically, and he could be abusive and quite difficult. But yes, after 3.5 years and 400 pages of dealing with, I did like him very much. Sometimes I want to smack him in the face, but he seems a kind of irresistible personality and really, as you say, a larger than life character. They broke the mold when they made him, it seems.
So, what qualities of Desi do you think made it possible for him to popularize Latino music, go on the vaudeville circuit? And as you clearly stated in the book, it wasn't that he necessarily had musical skills, but how did he carry himself forward and then also have some kind of vision about the future of television?
Yeah, quite how he had the vision, I'm not sure of, except that he obviously was was willing to see that it had. There's a wonderful quote he told a Broadway columnist in 1958 that we've just begun to see the future of television. Someday you'll have a television as big as your wall, as big as your house, and I take a sense that you guys
We're
are
seeing
watching.
you on a
You're
TV
watching a
that
great big screen in the library in southeastern Pennsylvania right now. The thing that I think is a key to his motivation is because he had lost everything at such a formative age, he was determined, he had enormous drive to succeed. And I think he also had a corollary willingness to take risks. His attitude was, I've lost everything. So what am I risking by trying something that's an unproven business, an unproven medium, an unproven show? And that gave him enormous courage to take risks that other people might not have wanted to take. The problem is, I think by the end of his life, or when the middle of his success, it also made him erroneously think that simply because he'd succeeded in taking risks, he could keep taking risks forever. And eventually, he gambled wrong because he'd undermined himself with his drinking and his unreliable behavior. But I really think he must have had enormous. And then I think also, Alice, because he was raised in this princely fashion, he was an only child. And he grew up, knowing that he was a big deal in his hometown and in the eyes of his family. That must have, even despite the reverses he experienced, must have instilled in him a certain amount of, you know, um, underlying confidence, like I am somebody and I can, gangway world, get off of my runway.
Do you think maybe he was addicted to adrenaline?
Yeah, so I think there was probably, oh, I think I'm not a clinician, so I should be careful.
Yeah.
But I think it's pretty clear that he suffered from some kind of undiagnosed PTSD or trauma of some kind, and that he sought relief from that in alcohol and the womanizing. But I think he probably was an adrenaline junkie in a way that he lived for the thrill of it all, and he lived life on the edge. He didn't live anything by half measures. He said of himself that the one thing he could never learn was moderation. If he partied too hard. If he worked too hard. If he drank too much. And he was not a person of, the golden mean.
No.
I'm a little different than the rest of the group here, meaning that I was there when he was there. I was born and raised in LA. I left there in the sixties. And part of it, I never realized what was going on. His escapades were not well known to the public, even though they were, I didn't get the local scandal sheet. I had just the LA Times or the local Examiner or the local paper. So we didn't know. And the Latin lover, for some reason, is an image that they had even in the 50s. And he was just following the mold. Maybe he was the leader of it. I don't know. But that was never expressed to us at the teenage level where I was. And
Yeah,
half my
I think you're right. He was that kind of
famous.
that kind of behavior made it more into the scandal sheets and the trade press and the tabloid press. There was a scurrilous magazine in those days called Confidential, which made a specialty of writing about the sex lives of stars and politicians and so on. And some of the unflattering material about him led to there. But there came a point in the late 1950s when he got arrested for public drunkenness, and that did make the main papers and drew attention. But yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about him is that in the movies, he could never quite persuasively play the Latin lover type. He said when he was starting out in Hollywood that he wanted to be thought of as the Cuban Mickey Rooney. And in a way, he was kind of like that, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. He could do comedy, drama, music, dance. He could play the drums. And the hard part was that because of his accent, because of the limited number of roles for Latinos, he never quite made it in the movies. And paradoxically, it was the very thing that had worked against him in the movies, his thick accent, that ultimately became such a wonderful calling card and part of his persona as Ricky. Although the writers realized very quickly that only Lucy could make fun of Ricky's accent because it was clear that it was done from a loving place, and if other characters made fun of him, it could seem mean-spirited.
I have a question. It seemed like his father just didn't take an interest in him. You just said that he had scrapbooks, but whenever there was a big event in his life, he didn't show up.
Yes, I found that very sad. I think there's a way in which his father, who had also lost everything, must have been quite jealous of him. I think his father must have thought, who is he, this entertainer? I was a big politician in my home country, a member of Congress, possibly on track to rise even higher. And this is this drummer, entertainer, singer. And for a long time, his father didn't think that was a very respectable career for someone of his stature and status to pursue. And I think it's sad. It's sad, as you point out, that after little Lucy and Desi Jr. were born, it was many years before the grandfather came to see them. That's partly because Desi resented his father when he divorced his mother. There was a period of estrangement between them, and that wound up saddling Desi for the rest of his life with the care and feeding of his mother, who seems to have been a rather difficult personality. But I found that sad, yes, that his father, I think, I know his father loved him. I know his father, was proud of his achievements, but I'm sure we all know people in which the father tells, the world brags about his kid's achievements and doesn't bother to tell the kid how proud he is of him. And I think there was a little bit of that with Mayor Arnaz.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Well, I suppose even today, I mean, there are certain aspersions cast on entertainers. So,
Yeah. And
All the
Desi
pub-
faced the double bind of, I mean, way into the 1970s, newspapers would write about him. The LA Times, there's a story in which they would quote him in dialect, as if he were really Ricky Ricardo. They would quote him as saying, "The things I did before, not the things that mattered," And you can't imagine somebody, it's like comic dialect. You can't imagine somebody really doing that today. He had to put up with a lot of sneering and second guessing from people because he didn't look like everybody else and he didn't talk like everybody else. I think that's part of the reason he was underestimated.
Well, he clearly did not want to be Mr. Ball.
No, no, you know, and he had an understandably healthy ego of his own achievements. And Lucy was hypersensitive. I mean, she always wanted to make sure that he she knew how proud he was and how prickly he was about, you know, not wanting to be, as you say, Mr. Ball or be dismissed.
You made some allusion to this, but I'm curious, in the book, you went into some depth, but I wanted to ask you about his reputation among his peers.
Yes, his peers in Hollywood or his peers.
Yeah, in Hollywood.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately the people who were in the know, the people who really knew, understood how effective he was, understood his achievements. I think maybe the broader public didn't have nearly as much a sense of it. And the tragedy is that right at the very peak of his power and influence is when he really began to undermine himself with his drinking problem. So then he came to be seen as unreliable. But I think you know, there's an anecdote in the book where I quote his secretary as saying that a caller trying to reach him said he could reach President Eisenhower more easily than he could reach Desi Arnaz, and the secretary said, "Yeah, but the president doesn't have to do a show every week at 2." So he was definitely a force to be reckoned with, and people would talk about how explosive his negotiating style could be. That he would have, you know, partly he would do a performance of throw a temper tantrum for effect to get what he wanted, and then strike a deal, and then put his arm around the person and say, "Let's go have a drink." So I think the people who really knew him must have been aware of his skill, but people who only saw him from a distance thought of him as just this second banana actor who was, you know, supporting his wife.
I can't help but think, as I was reading this book, about all of the people who became famous and the trajectory up to the top, and then the leveling off and going downhill. And it just seems that he wasn't the only one that
No.
that had a career like that, that had a life like that. And you wonder, what is it that causes that? Is it too much fame? Is it on you? You know, you take things for granted. What is it that causes that? Because he didn't appreciate his opportunities anymore.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and I think, you know, there's a saying that too much is worse than not enough, and there is this phenomenon in which I think for him partly also again amateur shrink here. I think part of the time his success didn't seem quite real to him, and he somehow didn't feel he deserved it, and he was always pinching himself because you know, he wasn't an immigrant so much as he was a refugee. He'd fled the world he knew. He fled the world he grew up in. And the whole story of his life, in a sense, was in some way to get back to that place of stability that he had lost. Um, but yeah, it's a tragedy. I mean, he's far from the only entertainer who, or for that matter, person of any success, who, you know, who couldn't handle the success. I think it's a really interesting case and maybe a rarity that somebody has that kind of worldwide fame and the pressure that comes with it, who's able to handle it well and you know, keep perspective. Like I often, you know, George Clooney talks about how the great lesson for him was his Aunt Rosemary, who had been this giant singing star in the 1950s, and then in the 1960s suffered a nervous breakdown and addiction to pills and struggled and ultimately made a comeback at a much more niche level as a you know, kind of cabaret performer and recording artist. But that it made him realize when he was starting out in Hollywood and ever since that fame can be a cruel thing and a fleeting thing, and that you better try to keep your wits about you rather than, you know, believe your own press clippings after a while.
So, what do you think that the TV show I Love Lucy could bring to today's programming? And are there any present day productions that are similar to I Love Lucy in terms of comedy, character relationships, or production methods?
Well, there are a lot that are similar in production methods. I mean, The Big Bang Theory uses multiple cameras. I think it's an interesting question because obviously some of the portrayals of gender roles in I Love Lucy are pretty much out of date. The notion that the women are, but on the other hand, you could make the argument that Lucy Ricardo is a kind of proto-feminist character because she always wanted something more than being stuck behind the stove or the vacuum cleaner. Her goal was to break into show business, but she wanted to get out of her little shell, and be part of the wider world and be taken seriously. One of the reasons the show is still enjoyable in so many ways is that it's not topical at all. I mean, you would never know that Harry Truman is president or the Korean War is going on or anything like that. It's eternal. It's like the situations of Greek comedy. It's jealousy and rivalry and friendship and betrayal and ambition and you know getting stuck in crazy, huh? Getting stuck in crazy situations, and slipping on a banana peel. I mean, or trying to put the chocolates in the box as or these things are just as funny as they ever were.
Last couple of years ago, we were in Albuquerque, and I saw that they were having some sort of festival, and you had the opportunity to stomp grapes. I spent my whole life thinking that would be so much fun to be like I Love Lucy and stomp grapes. I have pictures. Isn't that funny? But just this little clip in my memory, and I've lost a lot of those little clips, but I have the I Love Lucy one.
Wow, that's funny. Even at the time they did that, there weren't very many places that still made wine with that method, and I forget what they had to do, but they had to find some place where I mean, they filmed it on the soundstage, but getting the information about how it worked was even then not that easy because the technique had, gone out of fashion. But that's still a pretty hilarious episode. And again, it was Lucille Ball's ability to improvise and devise spontaneous things and when doing those scenes. A lot of things were planned out to the letter, but then there were also so many things that in the moment she knew, partly because she would riff off the response of the live audience, and she would know how to milk a laugh and get applause.
Yeah. I'm curious to bring, you've done quite a bit of reporting. And as you said a few moments ago, that he wasn't so much an immigrant as a refugee. Right now with what's going on, with the crackdown of ICE and refugees and immigrants and all that's going on now, how do you think, I guess it's how do you think he would have done now as a young man? And he was very young, wasn't he, about 19 or 20 or something?
Yeah, like.
And also, do you know of anyone now that you could say, hey, this is Desi Arnaz 1.0 or 2.0, someone now, it's some immigrant, some refugee, or what's going on right now?
Yeah, I suspect there's somebody someplace that we don't know about who is that person. One of the things that, I mean, Desi personally was a conservative Republican, and he campaigned for Richard Nixon in 1968. But he also, when he came here, he started working when he first was playing in his first band in Miami Beach. He had come from Cuba he came on a temporary visa without the proper papers for permanent residency. And an INS officer, an immigration officer, came to see him at the hotel and said, you are working here illegally, and I'm going to give you 90 days to go back to Cuba and get in line and come in the right way. And he did that. And in Desi's memoir, he writes about how it just goes to show you there are some people in the world who have a heart. And you have to wonder with some of these sweeps that are happening now, whether there's somebody, being scooped up inadvertently or, unfairly, who would have a lot to offer the country in the future. And I think that's one of the things that's kind of quite scary and depressing about it is that Desi is an example of a person who showed that here in America we sound all different sort of ways, we look all sort of different ways, and he considered himself, as true blue and American as it was possible to be. And he was always quick to say that he didn't think he could have had the kind of success he had in any other country in the world, and he remained incredibly grateful for his American identity and his American citizenship, even being while he was fiercely proud of his Cuban heritage at the same time. So it gives you pause to think about what potential, superstar we may have inadvertently rounded up.
Because people who have been given an opportunity do amazing things. And I think we're missing out on that.
Hopefully temporarily. Yes. So Todd, do you have any future writing plans?
Well, I'm hoping that my next project will be a biography of Norman Lear. His widow has given me first crack at his archive, which is a daunting collection of about 1,400 boxes that are now in a warehouse in North Hollywood, waiting to be put someplace in an archive eventually. And I've begun that research, and I'm hoping that I can persuade Simon and Schuster that that's another good topic that they would be willing to publish. So I'm in the very beginning stages of that, and frankly, a little daunted, and like all writers, arranging to procrastinate because it seems hard. But that's my hope. Because Norman Lear, with All in the Family and those other pioneering sitcoms of the 1970s, which were also filmed live in front of a studio audience, really did for television in terms of bringing into the modern era topical themes and cutting edge politics and social issues. He made as many big changes in television in the 1970s as Desi did in the 1950s. And I was actually able to interview Norman not too long before he died, and he described Desi as a brilliant businessman in the persona of a wonderful entertainer, and that's a pretty good summary of what Desi Arnaz's life was like, I think.
Yeah, Norman Lear is a genius of creativity. And I think that would be a bestseller. That would be a book I'd be interested in reading.
He lived for 101 and a half years and had his life went from the presidency of Warren Harding to Donald Trump. So, he really lived the American century, and he cut his teeth in the oldest traditions of comedy and vaudeville. And then he worked in the early days of live television with Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin. And by the time he was almost 50 years old, by the time he created All in the Family. And, he's kind of an inspiration for those of us who are in the older parts of our life, that he kept active and involved to the very end of his life, partly by having a lot of younger colleagues and friends. And that's kind of an inspiration for, keeping yourself fresh.
Wow.
I love that show, and my dad was Archie Bunker. So we argued all the time, but he brought race in, he just addressed things that nobody else was talking about.
Yeah, no, I think it's really true, and he did it with humor and tenderness, and certainly the character of Edith is always the most big-hearted conscience of the show, who's always quietly. She loves Archie, but she also doesn't take any guff from him, and in some ways, she doesn't let him win the argument.
That's interesting, because I guess All in the Family maybe didn't have the staying power as much as I Love Lucy, because it was more of a current events commentary, or is that not true?
Well, there was a period in the 1970s when Norman Lear had 5 of the top 10 shows on television. It had All in the Family, Jeffersons, Good Times, Maude, Sanford and Son, and then so he was an unbelievable 800-pound gorilla in the room of television. There's a appearance where he appears on one of Bob Hope's specials, and Bob Hope greets him as Mr. Lear, and Norman says, "Oh, please, it's Norman," and Bob Hope says, "No. When I talk to the man who owns our industry, it's owns the industry I work in, it's Mr." And he was overwhelmingly successful. So, but one of the things that I think is true is that because television was such a nascent medium in the 1950s, and also because there were only 3 channels, everybody 60-70% of the television sets were tuned to I Love Lucy every Monday night. There's nothing, not really, maybe the Super Bowl, but there's no single program today that gets that kind of mass audience cutting across all ages and demographics, so that on Tuesday morning, everybody's talking about the same show. We're much, The highest rated show on network television in recent years has been CSI. And I think, if it got an audience of 10 million people per week in a country of 300 plus million, that was considered pretty great. Whereas I Love Lucy was getting 40 million people in a country of 160 or 170 million people. So you can see the difference. I mean,
Yeah, but there weren't even 150 million TVs at that time.
oh yeah, no, I mean, and the number of sets exploded dramatically between sort of 1949 and 1952, but yeah, and the screens were small and the reception was uneven. Anyway.
That is an interesting phenomenon now, the on-demand culture we have, and certainly has affected library service, where, years ago, you didn't necessarily have all of John Grisham's books available, and now the expectation is that you do, for example. And I think that's the same with television, that people aren't relegated necessarily to a Monday night at 9 o'clock program.
When you have ebooks in circulation now, is there a waiting list for those? Do you have a limited number of people who can get them out at any one time, or do you have both? Do you have audiobooks, ebooks, and physical books in the library?
Yes, and yes. So we have two services for ebooks. One is on the traditional level of you purchase, we're in a consortium, but you purchase one copy, so there's one copy available. The other system is completely on demand, and we are paying through the nose because people can just go in, check out whatever they want. And then we pay monthly on the usage.
Wow, to the publishers.
Well, it's a system.
Oh, through the consortium of the middleman of the library services.
Well, our consortium has Hoopla, actually, we've individually contracted with. It's a system called Hoopla, who negotiates with publishers,
right,
and they have set the pricing for, per loan pricing.
Got it.
So if we had a book group of 100 people here and we all read Desi Arnaz and it was on Hoopla, bang, all of a sudden we'd be charged a few $100s in 1 month for that book, your book, yes.
And how do you make up that revenue? Because I assume the library card is free for residents of.
Library card is free. We get the word out. Many libraries are admitting that they're being eaten alive by Hoopla. So in some extreme cases, some libraries are cutting out the service, or you can reduce the number of circulations per month per card. That's one way of moderating it. The other system is called Libby, that everybody probably also knows about. That's the buy one copy, have one available for a loan.
And people have to wait in line to get it.
Correct.
Got it.
Correct. But we have reports that we run, and so periodically, this is all news to the group here, so you can see their ears are kind of in tune what's going on. So on Libby, we run reports on holds, and so for the patrons of our library, we can run a report, and if the holds are more than a couple, then we'll go ahead and get another copy.
Got it.
Yeah.
But if we have a choice, you want us to borrow from Libby and not from Hoopla?
If you can.
Yeah.
Yes, although, it's a kind of Russian roulette, because purchasing on Libby is expensive. I mean, libraries, again, back to John Grisham, we can easily pay $80 for one copy of a new John Grisham book. Where if you go on your Kindle on Amazon, it's a fraction of that for a person. So, they are charging libraries top dollar for electronic books. And the audios are worse. They're more expensive.
Yeah, it took me a long time to get this book from Libby.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's a problem with the TV series now that could be the same reason for attention span? I know they say, 30 minutes, after 30 seconds, you've already lost half your audience.
Yeah,
So
no, I
that's-
think it's a really good point. Yeah. The attention spans are totally different now. And our children, my children who are not children, they're 22 and 25, but they have expectations. They can watch anything they want anytime they want and turn it off halfway through if they don't, like it. Or so, the days of having to take what you could get are, kind of gone.
Where do you find a tape machine now?
Well, it's, you have your DVR built in your smart TV,
Yeah.
your cable
Yeah.
box.
Absolutely.
Well, Todd, thank you so much for taking some time to
Thank
speak
you.
with us today. We really do appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I hope everything is good by Lancaster, and I wish you all the best. And thanks so much for your interest in the book. I'm really grateful.
Yeah, so we look forward to your next book on Norman Lear.
All right, from your lips too. Thank you very much. Take care now.
Okay,
Bye.
so you take care.
So your name was